How worried should we be about stubborn inflation?
Yes, we should be very concerned. Um, the reality is that the two key factors that led to the initial surge of the inflation were external global factors and very poor monetary policy by the Bank of England. They completely misread the situation. And both of those factors, in some respects, are now being reversed. The global factors have gone. The Bank of England is catching up with where they should have been. The challenge now, coming directly to your question, is the second round effects. Firms are passing on higher costs either to maintain profit margins or to increase profit margins. You've also focused on wages, although it should be stressed last year, wages were not the factor accounting for this inflation. So the second round effects are now evident. That makes us more concerned as economists, and that's why we should all be worried. The reality, though, is it's the Bank of England who really should be taking the blame here. They completely misread the situation a couple of years ago. The markets now have no confidence in the Bank of England. The governor and the MPC are seen as lacking competence and lacking credibility. And the real challenge now is that the Bank of England, even though they should be pausing in some respects, like the Americans last week, the US Federal Reserve, their central bank, has credibility. They were able to say, we're going to take a pause with a bias to raise rates again if necessary. That would be the position we should be in the UK if the Bank of England had credibility, but they don't. So tomorrow they're going to be forced to raise rates, probably quite sharply, probably by 0.5%, and they still will have a bias to have to raise rates again to try and get on top of the situation. So the worry should be not only about inflation, coming back to your question, but the fact that the Bank of England is now going to have to push rates up to such a level is going to weaken the economy, and if they push rates up too much, force a recession.
I mean, that is pretty grim, to be honest, listening to you. Really interesting to hear where you quite clearly put the majority of the blame. I guess my next question is, what do you think should happen next? Are we doing the right thing by increasing rates and having the squeeze and the pain that entails, or is there another path available?
Yeah, well, to answer that question, I think it's vital that people understand where we were a couple of years ago. At that time, I was on Sky saying, the question is, which P is it? Will inflation pass through? Will it persist? Or will it become permanent? The Bank of England said it was going to pass through quickly, be transitory. It was quite clear then, 2 years ago, they were wrong. Now we have inflation persisting. 2 years ago, when inflation hit 0.4% in February 2021, it was clear it was going to pick up. In fact, only 2 months later, it went above the 2% target. It was clear the economy was about to rebound as it was being unlocked. Therefore, in that situation, interest rates should have been increased. What happened? The Bank of England kept rates low. They injected a phenomenal amount of money into the economy through quantitative easing, and all 9 members of the MPC, Monetary Policy Committee, voted for it. And I'm on 2 boards in the city, and in early 2021, we received letters from the Bank of England saying, be prepared that your systems can tolerate negative interest rates. So not only did they not act, they went in the wrong direction. Since then, their credibility has been hit by the fact they've always been seen as too late. The way they communicate is literally terrible. There's a parallel universe between what is often said in the political world and what's actually said in the dealing rooms in the city. And now we have a situation where the city, global markets are saying, look, you need to show that you're on top of this situation. And unfortunately, the economy here is vulnerable because monetary policy tightening works with a long lag, 12 to 18 months. So we've already gone from interest rates of only 0.1 to 4.5%. A large part of that has yet to actually hit people and yet to hit companies. But now, because of the lack of credibility and because of the poor inflation figures for the last few months, inflation expectations are rising. The bank is going to have to push rates higher. What would I do? Well, if I was there, we wouldn't be in this situation because it was quite clear 2 years ago what needed to be done. But now we are where we are. You have to basically restore credibility and confidence. What the bank has to do in monetary terms is effectively what Jeremy Hunt had to do in fiscal terms last autumn. He had to try and restore some credibility by taking tough action. The bank now has to do that. But when an economy already has interest rates at the highest level for some time, and parts of the economy are vulnerable to higher rates because they're over leveraged, that means the more you push rates up, the more you're going to add to problems in terms of the real economy. So if one looks at the government's 5 measures, 3 of those are economic measures. Inflation will fall, albeit stubborn at the moment, but it will fall. But the price of it falling might impact 2 of those other 3 economic measures the Prime Minister has highlighted, namely growth and debt. Because if the economy is weak and if interest rates are higher, our debt picture, government debt, becomes more vulnerable. Has to be said, even though the situation is difficult in the UK, it is a Western world problem. We've been impacted a bit more by energy prices here in the UK, but it's a problem impacting Western Europe, the States, as well as the UK, but partly because of the reasons I've just articulated.
I just want to jump in, if I may, because I do want to get to one other point. You were mentioning debt there, and I think this is another big part of the conversation, right? You were saying that the government has restored some fiscal credibility, but I guess my question is, has it? Because, today we saw debt reaching 100% of GDP. We're talking about, politicians clamouring for tax cuts if they're on the Conservative side. On the Labour side, they're talking about big investment. Do politicians of all colours, really get fiscal restraint that perhaps is needed in order to keep inflation low?
Yeah, the International Monetary Fund a few months ago came out with something called their fiscal monitor. 6 of the 7 G7 countries will likely be in a debt trap over the next 5 years, according to the International Monetary Fund. That's where your debt is around 100% of GDP. That is the size of your economy. And the rate of interest you're paying on it is higher than your rate of economic growth. It doesn't really matter who's in power at the moment or who wins the next election. They inherit that very difficult backdrop. The choices then need to be made after that. So the way out of a debt trap is to basically get on top of inflation. That allows inflation to come down. It allows interest rates to stabilize, and then have a pro-growth economic strategy. But that takes some time. But for the moment, it's about stabilizing the markets by getting on top of inflation. But coming back to your question, the best way out of the debt problem is to keep your interest rates low and to get your rate of economic growth up. And to do that, you need to actually have more proactive policies to help business and actually reduce the cost of living for consumers. The good news in the UK is the jobs market is pretty good. So it's not all pessimistic. The job situation is the one real positive out there at the moment.
It's quite nice to have a bit of a positive news, I have to say. I feel a bit guilty today because I feel like we're just having so much bad news in the programme, but it does feel like it's one of those days. When I was interviewing Mark Harper earlier, he made big points about pay restraint. He clearly believes, and this is obviously a view in government as well, that pay rises are driving inflation. Are they right?
Look, last year, the surge in inflation had nothing to do with higher wages, but partly because we haven't, as a country, largely because of the central bank, the Bank of England, not got on top of inflation. We're in that second round phase. And in the second round phase, wages and corporate behaviour in terms of profit margins is key. So it's not just workers, it's also what companies do. And that's why the argument is, it's a bit of a difficult argument, though, for the general public to hear, is that's why people say you have to tighten monetary policy to slow the economy down. But do bear in mind, as I was saying earlier, monetary policy works with a lag. It's a long lag. What I hope is that the Bank of England doesn't overdo it by tightening too much. But coming back to your question, higher wages weren't the reason last year, but you can't blame people for seeking higher wages now because inflation is high. But as inflation starts to fall over the next year, one would expect wage increases to slow as well, the pace of growth to decelerate.
Really interesting to talk. Thanks very much for giving your perspective.